Well, welcome, friends. My name is Eller, and even though my picture seems to be frozen in a funny kind of expression, I'm glad to welcome you here to this webinar. I'm looking forward to being able to be your technical host for the time that we spend together, and looking forward to the presentation today. Before we begin, I'll just notice that there's the chat window that's up on your upper left, and I'm glad to see that many of you have participated there. And if you have any technical issues, please contact me by chatting through there, and I'll see what I can do to help you. We also have a whole list of other webinars that are coming up, so feel free to scroll that main window and see what's yet to come and register for those events, because we'd like to have you join as many as you can. But without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Stan Duick, who will introduce our presenter for today. Stan, take it away.
Martyn. And it's a pleasure to have everyone join us today for the webinar with Martyn Payne on Families in the Hood. And we're also pleased that we can collaborate in bringing these webinars to you. And these webinars are brought to you by the Center for Anabaptist Studies at Bristol Baptist College, Bristol Baptist College, Baptist Together, Urban Expression U.K, the Church of the Brethren, and also we are excited that this particular one is hosted and sponsored as well by the Center for Family and Childhood Studies at Bristol Baptist College. So with such an effort, we feel that we are able to bring such quality webinars to you. Well, it's a pleasure to introduce to you the presenter for today's event, Martyn Payne, who will be presenting on Families in the Hood. And Martyn is based in East London, and Martyn has worked with the Bible Reading Fellowship in a number of roles over the past 11 years. Currently, Martyn is part of the Bible Reading Fellowship's Messy Church team, and visiting messy churches nationally, both to listen to stories and to offer encouragement and professional consultation on the development of this new missional form of church for all ages in all places. And so, without further ado, I want to invite Martyn Payne to join us on stage and bring to us your presentation on Families in the Hood. Martyn, welcome.
Hi there. It's really good to be with you, and strange, I must admit, to be speaking to people everywhere from my living room. Good job you can't actually see the real living room. Anyway, it's good to be here, and a welcome from me, and thank you for your introduction, Stan. As you've heard, this is part of a series looking at families from the biblical perspective and relating that to the reality for families today in today's world. And how can the church connect with families in the West today? So it's the third in a series. My presentation particularly focuses on family life at the sharp end of society, where there is deprivation and challenge for many people today. It's often said that God is revealed through scriptures as being a God with a particular bias towards the poor, the marginalized, the neglected, what the Bible describes as the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. These are the people in families who find life tough or are being pushed to one side in so many ways by unjust systems, unfair economic circumstances, and natural disasters or deprivations that come through war and discrimination, or the worst that life can throw at them. If we're going to look at families in this series, which we are doing, we need to recognize that many experience family lives that are far from comfortable and secure. Understanding their circumstances, their hopes and aspirations must be part of the commandment to love our neighbour as ourselves. Recently, in the UK, we've been remembering a famous hero of ours from history. Perhaps you'll recognise him from the statue on the left in my slide there. It was 50 years ago that Sir Winston Churchill died, and we witnessed the great pomp and ceremony of his funeral here in London, where I live. He's widely regarded as one of the greatest Britons of all time, rising to prominence during the Second World War and leading this nation during tough times. We're very good at ceremony in Britain, and we like to remember our history. There have been programmes about him on the television and radio, and one particular programme gave me a new insight into him that struck me particularly. Sir Winston came from an aristocratic background. He could trace his roots back to the Duke of Marlborough, whose family seat is Blenheim Palace near Oxford. And the commentator on the programme I was listening to remarked that despite all the adulation shown Winston Churchill in his lifetime, and the great respect among the crowds at his funeral, he himself had little understanding, it seems, of ordinary people's lives. He was surrounded by servants and led a well-protected existence. He stood almost at arm's length from the lives of most people who had voted him into power at a crucial time in our history. If the truth be told, it came over quite clear that he was very much out of touch with what most people thought and most people put up with in everyday life. It struck me that many people feel the church is something like Winston Churchill. It's been a great institution in its day, and indeed it's still doing a great many things, good things, but most of those who are part of the church perhaps don't often understand what it means to live a life on the breadline, not knowing where the next pay packet comes from, getting by on payday loans that will come back to bite them. And those people feel quite out of place, perhaps, in a world of order and beauty and even plenty, which seems to be the world that the church in many parts of the Western world inhabits. So it's no wonder that there are many questions raised by people about the church and its commitment to understanding of families who live in socially deprived areas. This isn't the whole story, of course, but it's a perspective which we need to take into our reckoning when we think through some of these issues about ordinary families in real situations in communities perhaps just round the corner from you and I. Scripture challenges us to do some pretty serious thinking about this, and I'm particularly thinking of what God himself did by coming among us as Jesus Christ. His incarnation, as described in the Message version of John chapter 1 verse 14, connects with our title very well. It says, here it is on the screen, Jesus became a human being and moved into the neighborhood, moved into the hood. God didn't stay distant, but came close, lived alongside working class fishermen, marginalized Galileans, families struggling under foreign occupation. So the imperative for our understanding of families in these circumstances is the life of Jesus Christ himself. It's with this challenging, I have to confess, a bit uncomfortable truth at times, I'm going to try and share some of my experience and findings as I have looked at what it means to engage with families on the edge, in the hood. I'm going to pause every now and then in my presentation, and I'm going to put some questions up which might, I hope, prompt you to make some comments. And my first set of questions are these, so just let these work with you as you're listening to what I'm saying. I wonder how and in what ways your church or your Christian community is taking this challenge to move into the neighbourhood seriously. I wonder how you're recognising the needs of your community and encountering the lives of those who have not perhaps enjoyed the same privileges and support that you have had in your own family life. And I wonder what it means for you to become the hands and feet of Jesus and move into the neighbourhood. They're big questions, aren't they? The ideas I have to share on this topic come from my work with the Bible Reading Fellowship. There's the logo up on the left-hand side there. I've been with them about 12 years now, working alongside churches and in schools, trying to find creative ways to explore the stories of the Bible and to reflect on the challenge of the gospel. My background is in teaching, in fact, in the East End of London, where I very readily confess I learnt far more than I taught during my years as a secondary school teacher. The lives of the children I worked with were very different from my own upbringing in northwest England, where I knew the security of a mum and a dad who loved me, and the safety of a home where there was no particular financial hardship. The lives of the children I worked with, though, were much more chaotic, and the families they came from far less easy to define. Even back in the 80s and 90s when I was teaching, in most of the classes there was only a small minority of children who were living with their biological mother and father. Not that that means they were necessarily deprived, and we must be careful not to make judgments about those things, because wherever there's a commitment of love and care, then that can often be far more important than any contractual relationship as defined by a piece of paper. My most recent work has been with BRF and with something called Messy Church. You can see the splat of the logo up there on the top left-hand side of that particular slide. It's a strange title. The very name makes some people raise an eyebrow and smile. And in the context of this webinar, it's also very significant, I think. Life has become increasingly messy for many people today, from whatever background they come. In some areas of this country, and in some pockets of some cities, belonging to a family means something quite different than what it might have done many years ago. Although in the UK, the most common family type is still children with married parents, male and female, the number of different sorts of families is growing rapidly. There are households containing 2 or more families. There's a growing number of parents, lone parents with dependent children, an increasing number of children for whom the norm is to have a number of stepfathers or mothers whom they would call family. Lives are much messier. And perhaps Messy Church is one way in which we can recognise this as church, and a church that often struggle perhaps to relate this sort of chaotic living. I need to explain Messy Church a bit more, and you can see something on the screen there. It's an attempt to do church differently. Lucy Moore, who is listening to this, and who was part of the team with whom I work, first experimented with this fresh expression of church just over 10 years ago in a suburb north of a place called Portsmouth on the south coast of England. As a church, they were conscious that they were not reaching a large majority of local families in the hood, in the neighbourhood, for whom Sunday church, and for all sorts of reasons, was just off their radar. So much else happens on a Sunday in England, in the UK. And however welcoming and however attractive we make our Sunday services, there's still something quite alien to a generation of adults and children who have no experience of the Christian faith at all. It's all too wordy, maybe even too worthy for many people. Like Winston Churchill, the church seems to not relate to or understand ordinary people's lives. The Messy Church experiment was in many ways not something very remarkable. Essentially, it meant consulting the community to find a better and more convenient time to meet. It meant intentionally using more creative ways to approach learning, so that the Bible text was explored not through a sermon, but through a range of hands-on activities and games and crafts. It includes a celebration time. You can see there on the screen. This is a particular timing for an evening after school time. The celebration word being used rather than worship, because people don't quite relate to the word worship so much nowadays, where the Bible story is told in a creative, interactive way. maybe something simple to sing, some space for prayer and reflection, and then most important, you can see there, a meal. Now the latter is there in the Bible, of course. When Jesus moved into the neighbourhood, according to many gospel stories, he spent time sat down at the meal table talking to people. This simple pattern of doing church differently has since that beginning caught the imagination of congregations up and down the UK and now around the world. Messy church is now one of the most well-known expressions of church, special expressions of church in the UK. And on the BRF Messy Church website, we're receiving about 2 or 3 new registrations every single day. At the latest count, there are towards 2,800 messy churches that we know of, and probably at least double that number who haven't registered. All denominations and traditions of church have found this to be a new way to put on flesh and blood like Jesus and move into the neighbourhood. I want to pause there for a moment because there are various questions coming in, and I know Stan is going to pick up some of those. But I'll leave you with some other questions at this moment as well. Excuse me, moving my papers around. I wonder what some local families might think of your church service if they've never been to a church before. And I wonder what those families might understand to be the heart of the Christian faith from what they observe. And I wonder how much your congregation is prepared to step into the neighbourhood and meet people where they are rather than wait for them to come to you.
Thank you, Martyn. Your illustration with Winston Churchill brought something to mind about oftentimes when churches do outreach to their communities, we often don't understand the kinds of living conditions that people have or the types of housing. And one illustration was, for example, giving food away at Christmas, where one sharp member said, sometimes we give turkeys with well intentions, but have we ever thought that maybe those turkeys don't fit into the ovens of these families that have stoves and ovens that are much smaller than what we have in our homes? So that whole thing just came to mind when you shared.
It is, and that's good, and a good example of the church thinking it knows what it can give and ought to give, but hasn't actually consulted and listened to the people it wants to serve. A messy church certainly makes that first step. Actually, all fresh expressions of church want to make the first step of listening to their community, listening before doing.
Jackie shares that she met 2 pastors in the last week running messy churches on a Sunday, but at tea time.
Yeah.
Say more about and you mentioned the 2,800 churches, that are around. What are some of the varieties in the way messy church is being, presented or shared with the communities? What are some of the varieties or differences that you're seeing in different locations and places?
Thanks, Dan. Yes, and thank you for that question too, Jackie. Certainly, messy church has a variety of shapes and sizes and chooses different times on that very principle that it's the right time for the community rather than the time that suits the church. Messy church is actually about 10 years old now in the UK, and I joined the team about 3 years ago. And my task was actually to go and visit lots of messy churches around the country. I got the amazing brief of spending time listening to messy church leaders and those who come along to messy church and listening to what the children have to say. That's something particularly precious, I think, and important. And I visited about 100 messy churches now around the country. I've got a wide range of reflections about this particular missionary movement, I would call it, in the UK and around the world. some of them are after school, some of them are Saturday afternoon, some are Sunday afternoon. More rarely will they be at the traditional church time of a Sunday morning, because they are trying to reach and connect with new families, families in the hood, as we were talking about, who do not normally come near church. It's about engaging with those families. I must add from the start, though, it's not just children and their parents. It's an all-age experience of church that includes older people who enjoy being around children again and learning with them and from them. I've gone to messy churches where there are single folk too, who have found it a place where they can belong and serve, because it's speaking a language and doing church in a way that connects with their everyday lives. It's a place where young and old can rub shoulders together, and they can learn something of God's love and what it looks like in a human person alongside them. But they're held together, these messy churches, not by just a sort of template from on high or a program that everyone must follow slavishly. That there's no central control for messy church. The ones I visit vary greatly. And this actually touches on a key question from my modest research. Can messy church truly move into the neighbourhood along all sorts of families, or are there some limitations? Church planting in the inner city. Shall I pause there? Sorry.
I'm sorry. Susan does have a comment and question, and there's a couple that they'd like you to respond to. She's in St. Petersburg, Florida, and she writes, "We are starting a family promise here in our town where 13 host churches have 4 homeless families at a time stay at their church 1 week or 4 times a year. And they go to a day center during the day and school. And as the families work on getting jobs and housing, as well as other case management needs, do you think we can apply this sort of creative storytelling, crafts, and discussion during meals with families? And how do you invite those in the community to this alternative church service? What would you advise? How would you advertise such a messy church?"
Thank you, Susan, for a question there. It sounds, I could spend a whole seminar talking about that, I think. It's exciting what you're doing and working together with other churches. That sounds very exciting too. Messy Church has a set of values. I think I just move on to the next slide. It may well be there. Not quite sure. No, I'll move on. I'll go back. A set of values which has shaped what it's doing. And those values include making sure it's a Christ-centered expression of church, as all churches should be. But in the process, obviously, by sitting alongside families, you are meeting them where their need is. And many messy churches also include in Britain food banks as part of what happens. I visited one very recently in North London, where the messy church and the food bank work very closely together. There are many families who haven't got enough money to make ends meet in terms of their food in the week. So there's a range of things. And you ask about the advertising. Within the UK, like anywhere, we just have to use every avenue possible. People have talked at the school gates with parents. People have used and worked cooperatively with the school to invite families to come. Adverts to go up in the library. They have leafleted doors. There's a whole range of ways in which Messy Church has made the connections and opened its doors at the time that works well for the community, rather than what works well for the church. I hope that begins to answer your question. Church planting in the inner city, which is really where, or similar areas where deprived families are, offers quite a challenge for the church. There are stories of limited success, but often heartbreaking failure. I think one of the reasons is that church often embodies middle-class values in some ways, and in its structures and its organisation. It's been about doing things to and for congregations rather than with them. And not surprising, this model has struggled to take root in the hood. One question in my research was whether this was still true for Messy Church, despite its honourable intentions to be a church for the community. And what were the best frameworks for a success story, and everywhere, not just in the leafy suburbs, but in the heart of, like, my East End, where I live. So I had to address those questions as when on my visits about how successful how honest we are about our success stories and our failures, especially for families where church is just a blip on the horizon, if that. I'm not sure we're in the same place in the UK as you are in America, but a huge percentage of families in the UK will have had no experience of church for at least 2 generations. And the question carries on, how sincere are we as a church in our attempts to sit alongside those people? Is it so easy for churches to become comfortable, cosy places of sameness rather than taking risks and stepping out into the dangerous and difficult world motivated by God's love? Where does your church sit in its engagement with families in the neighbourhood? Well, we've heard some examples, and it's challenging and it's not easy. I'll move on. At the beginning of my Messy Church research into areas of social deprivation and Messy Church, I struggled, first of all, to define what those areas exactly were. It's not easy to label a particular estate in London or a group of streets, for example, as deprived, especially because wealth and poverty sit very close together. It's quite easy to move from one to the other within a couple of streets. The situation in our cities has become quite messy in the UK. And in addition, in the UK, in recent years, has come a rich ethnic mix in our inner cities and in other parts of the country, which has brought new cultural understandings of what is important in life. Nevertheless, there are some accepted understandings of what deprivation mean, and it's not always to do with money, of course, although it can't be left out of the equation. It's about attitudes to life, about what's valued as important. It's got to do with educational background and opportunities, and it's linked to the importance, I think, most importantly, of relationships. And I think relationships are at the heart of much of this, and indeed they are at the heart of Messy Church too, an attempt to build honest and fruitful friendships with people. I mentioned the values before. One of the key values of Messy Church is hospitality. It's been one of those core values from the very start. And it should be for every church, of course. But that isn't just about asking people what we can do for them, providing turkeys at Christmas as Stan says or whatever, which can be very patronising sometimes because it doesn't take account of the ovens, as you mentioned. But it's about what we can receive as well, a reciprocity of friendship. And I believe Messy Church is offering us a new wineskin to enable this to happen. It's not by its nature a hierarchical church where those who know teach those who don't know, and those who understand worship lead those who do not understand worship. It inspires instead to be an enterprise that's a together enterprise, in which those who come can, if they want to, give as well as receive. It's team church, in which many people of different abilities and ages can have a part to play. Teenagers can have a part to play, as well as your 8-year-olds can have a part to play. Young adults and young children. I suppose in a way it's trying, very imperfectly, but it's trying to be an expression of the body of Christ, as described by Paul in his letters, his famous image of the body of Christ. Well, every bit's important, and difference leads to growth in maturity as Christians, rather than rivalry and disrespect. In my visits to Messy Churches in more challenging areas, it's been interesting to note that how good teams recognise this dimension and have found ways to involve Messy Church guests on the team and, more importantly, receive from them the gifts that they bring. I just want to share a quick story here. I think back to one Messy visit where the team was perhaps taken surprise, but thankfully did receive the gifts. 2 families came. The first lady had a child with special needs, and she knew Makaton, which is a sign language, and so she offered to sign some of the songs and the story, not just for her own child, but for everyone there, and they welcomed that. Later during the meal, another new mum, who was in fact a Muslim by upbringing, brought along a birthday cake for her child, and she wanted to share that with everyone in Messy Church. It became like an unexpected dessert for the meal, and it was good to be able to receive her gift in this way. When people are valued, they flourish. To take part and to have an ownership in what is going on is so much, can happen so easily in Messy Church if it's allowed, through the activities, through the tables activities, through the celebration, the meal. There's plenty of scope for this sort of belonging to begin to happen. And that's something I've seen, the giving and receiving in Messy Church. I'll throw a few more questions up, and then perhaps, Stan, you might want to pick up a few more comments. I wonder how your church would react to those who arrived for the first time but wanted to contribute to the service rather than just be passive members. That's interesting, isn't it?
That is.
And I wonder how you could make it possible within your church service structures to allow families from the neighbourhood to feel they had an active and valued part in what was going on. Are there opportunities in your congregational setting to receive and not just be busy givers?
Well, the comment that Susan made earlier was responded to by a number of people. Kathy and Julie shared how they advertise. Kathy shares that they send leaflets to schools for every pupil, email people who've been there before. They put posters, banners, and so forth. Julie shares that in her experience, it's the personal approach that works best. The fact that having an invitation face-to-face makes other people feel valued. And Wallace makes a wonderful observation. He says the church seems to go into people's neighborhoods, but go back into their own after the visit. Mm-hmm. And so
that's interesting.
So you wonder about the genuineness of our visit as well. And then I believe Lucy confirms that. And then Kathy was sharing how her 8-year-old son is their best ambassador, that he tells everyone, persuades lots of people to come. And so it just shows that everyone, no matter what age, can have a real role in church that is really hospitable. You bring up something that about hospitality that seems to be at least an issue here in the United States. Hospitality for us tends to mean that we are a welcoming church, but we wait for people to show up. What I'm hearing you say is hospitality also has that other end of it, of being inviting, but going out into a community where we open ourselves up to the neighborhood, the people of the neighborhood, and not just expect people to come and change the way we like them to be.
Exactly, Stan. Yeah, the hospitality value is really special and important. In all church, it should be in all church, of course, and it's one of the key values of Messy Church. It's about creating a new, safe place to be together. And that can be within the traditional church building, but many Messy churches choose another safe venue, maybe the school, maybe the village hall, the hall of the church. Those sort of changes are part of how Messy Church can create that safe place for families who would feel they were receivers rather than givers, as you talked about, if they come to our traditional Sunday church. I'll move on to some of the other challenges I've come across, perhaps in my visits, and you'll hear this, what I've just said, being echoed there again. There are practical challenges and questions I've come across in my visits, and I don't pretend to know all the answers. As I've already said, family shapes are very different today. Let's click the next slide on. And particularly in deprived areas, just who is looking after whom in a family is a very basic question in some cases. And to identify the carer is quite complicated. In one Messy church over several days in a deprived city area, I saw children arrive with older step teenagers coming as the adults who were caring for them. And in the same place, it felt that it was the child who was the carer for the adult who came with them. So things are quite messy. And calling it Messy Church is part of the hospitality, actually, because it's saying that you're very welcome, because things aren't what the expected norm is, sadly, by some. Messy is more than just there's paint and glue involved. It's vital that families with messy lives feel that they can be accepted for what they are, and the Messy Church can offer just that sort of welcome. Other next questions often raised by those looking on at Messy Church, trying to work in deprived areas. One of the questions is about the creative dimension of Messy Church. When they're making stuff and playing and crafts and so on, it comes under scrutiny by some, and this seems very attractive, perhaps, to some families. But there are some families from the hood who perhaps have never had a chance to have free play like this, and it can be quite daunting, and I've come across this a number of times. Children perhaps take to it quickly, children lead the way, although even there they might prefer some sort of structure, but the adults tend to hang back and watch, because it's new, and it's perhaps a bit strange. It can be from all sorts of reasons, of course, but I think probably one of the ways it comes, one of the roots of it, is often inappropriate and unhappy experiences in school, where that creative play has been suppressed, or it's just been rubbished in some way. So it takes some while to build up confidence. The best way I've seen this change and happen for the better is, and slowly, is where activity leaders themselves show some enthusiasm about making and doing as a way of learning, kinesthetic ways of learning, and their enthusiasm is caught slowly by those who are coming, and they're drawn in slowly. We've seen this happen a number, they're drawn slowly in. And families in the hood are able to learn about God slowly and thoughtfully and carefully, not through a traditional wordy style of doing things, which wouldn't work, but through this hands-on, conversational way of talking about things. With families who have experienced the worst that life could throw at them and who had a bad start, finding a safe place is perhaps the heart of Messy Church. I'm back to what I mentioned before. And surely our Christian faith is about creating a safe space of love close to the heart of God, where we can let go of what's spoiling us and we discover who we're always meant to be. Messy churches are more concerned about doing this. Messy churches should be more concerned about doing this, and they are, the ones I visited, rather than producing a finished quality product or a beautiful song or conveying an important Bible truth. Where people are working on the safe space aspect, I think families in the hood can flourish and begin a journey of faith alongside those from the team who are also on that same journey. There's the values you can see on my slide of Messy Church. It's Christ-centered, there's creativity, there's hospitality, there's celebration, and it's for all ages. Among the many Messy churches I've visited, I have great admiration for those trying to work out its values of hospitality and creativity and so on in the more challenging parts of society. Some have even decided that their Messy Church needs to be more frequent than monthly, which is the norm in the UK and around the world, because their families in the hood don't live diarised lives and won't remember to come on the second Saturday or the third Friday or whatever. And yet even with this greater frequency, even there it takes a long time to belong, a long time to feel safe. The journey of feeling safe is a long one for those who've only ever experienced disturbance and brokenness in their lives. Sometimes we feel that a family belongs long before it really does. In this respect, my admiration for these Messy Church leaders and teams is paralleled by my admiration for those pioneer missionaries, both in the present day and the past, who have sat long with people before they began to speak. They've listened before they've spoken. They learnt from before they taught. They waited for the opportunity to share what they knew about God, while also respecting that God was already doing something in the place where they were. And I think that missionary gift is part of what Messy Church is rediscovering in the UK today, certainly. I'll throw some questions up again, and maybe Stan wants to gather some more things that are happening. So I wonder where your church listens to the needs, how you can make your church a safe place, And I wonder whether the church has really grasped the missionary challenge that lies before it today in terms of stepping into the shoes of the many people who never come near its doors and services. Over to Stan.
I'm going to start with the comment that is shared by a guest, and we invite the guest if he or she would share their name, but states, I wonder how often we all allow themselves to be in that safe place for themselves. It means making ourselves vulnerable, and we're not particularly good at that.
Yes, I think so. Messy church is a risky thing for many teens. They are encountering for the first time people who have no faith whatsoever or are far away from church, and they've got to listen to the concerns of those people's lives when they're talking with them. It's not easy. I've been to messy churches where there are leaders who can do this and others who are still working out how to do it. Yeah, it's a mixture of success and trial and failure and getting up and trying again. I totally agree.
And by the way, that was Sean Hancock that just revealed that she is the guest. So I want to go back to some of the comments that were also being made. Jane, Jane, because there was talk earlier about younger children, and you brought that up. But Jane makes the comment, she says, younger children connect well with the young leaders, and young leaders flourish when they feel valued and given opportunity to have a go. Say more about what you're observing with that in response to Jane's comment.
Thank you, Stan, and thank you, Jane. Messy Church gives a particular opportunity that sadly Sunday Church doesn't always manage to do in terms of giving leadership to young people. I don't know whether this is true in the States or not, but certainly in schools in the UK, children from quite early years are encouraged to take leadership roles in schools, to be on committees making decisions. They come to churches and they don't actually get a chance to do very much at all. Certainly, as a Christian, I believe that God can speak through children as powerfully, and perhaps sometimes more powerfully, than adults. And we need to give opportunities for those children to speak and be involved. At the moment, we've got a young intern on our team who's looking at the role of teenagers in Messy Church, and he is discovering some wonderful stories where teenagers are helping to shape the experience of church, help create that safe place, leading activities, having input into how the church grows, as much as the older leaders. They are part of the leadership team on equal footing. And as Jane says, young children can relate to the 15 and 14-year-olds easier than perhaps to the other age groups, although the grandparent-grandchild relationship is very powerful too in Messy Church. Many Messy churches have started off with younger children, but they're on a journey to growing. And this is an element which is particularly what BRF and Messy Church are looking at, as to how we can help those Messy churches to stay intentionally intergenerational for this positive reason.
I know, like for many churches in the United States, where they have started like a midweek program with the intention of connecting to people in the neighborhoods. It tends to be more something like we do it for children, and then as soon as they expand it and make it intergenerational, they're often amazed at the response by families to come to church and respond to it. And for our church where I pastored in, it was actually that created the greatest open door for people actually to connect to our church, was that kind of program.
That's interesting.
Jackie makes a comment. She says this kind of creativity is great for ordinary church people who actually enjoy engaging with God in a diversity of ways. That seems like something that Messy Church allows people the physical, the emotional, and the relational space to just come and be and to engage with God, and thereby you're creating this safe spiritual space as well. Is that kind of a sense of what's happening?
All those things are true with Messy Church at its best. It's on a journey. We are only beginning. It's only 10 years old, and we're discovering all sorts of things as we travel along. It was never designed as an event that should morph into Sunday church for people. It was always envisaged as this was going to become church. It's a missionary congregation of the parish church, whatever that tradition is. But it's because it's new, because it's a fresh expression, it's giving us a chance to rethink lots of things as to how church can look, how it can feel for the outsider, how it can be shaped as much by the insights of the outsider as the story of the insider, so that we meet and share that together. We have a story to share, but we also have stories to listen to as well, and that's a powerful element of Messy Church. I had a question somewhere on my things here. I can't remember where I got to now, but I had an interesting question I wanted to. Yeah, here we are. I'll pick up. I've got lots of. There's questions around different elements of Messy Church. But shall I pick up on a few of those as I move on? Okay. On my travels, there's been all sorts of questions really I've looked at, and it's very interesting that traditional church has felt that the sharing of the word and the message is the most important part. Now, sharing that message is important, but it comes in Messy Church through a whole variety of parts of that church, not least of it through the meal. The talking about our lives and entering other people's lives, as Jesus did when he sat at meal tables and chatted to people, is also the way you incarnate that word of God. And so having the meal and having the activity tables, having the welcome at the door, and having a time of storytelling, all that is a chance to encounter each other and together encounter God. And that's something I've seen working in Messy Church. Sometimes Messy Churches think it's all hanging on the moment where they share the Bible story, but actually it's not. The message part is everywhere, and it's in the meal, it's in the whole mix of what's going on. There's a Bible story which you'll know well, and it's from Luke 10, and it's a precious one to us in Messy Church perhaps, because it's the story of Jesus sending out the 70 or 72 in some versions, who go to prepare the way in the cities and towns of Samaria, because Jesus is coming there soon. And they go with a message. The kingdom of God is coming, is near. But how do they share it? Well, you'll know the story. They are meant to go into people's homes and sit and talk and eat. They are meant to bring peace and healing to those homes, but they're meant to receive hospitality as a way of sharing the story. It's a very interesting passage in terms of how we share our precious story today. And Messy Church tries to pick up that sense of creating a safe place around the tables, whether they're meal tables or activity tables, to share the story. And on the last bit I put here, it's interesting, learning from the outsider in Messy Church. Where else do we meet those outsiders? Very often they don't come to our Sunday church anymore, but meeting them in Messy Church is quite a challenge to us. And I think Jesus showed us the way here, because we know the stories of how when he met the Roman soldier, the centurion, or the Samaritan leper, or the Syrophoenician woman, he modelled actually learning from them. He was amazed at their faith. He was amazed at what they already knew about God, although they were outside the people of God. They weren't insiders. So I think Jesus was actually showing us the way to be listeners as well as sharers of the word. And I wonder whether that's got something to say to us in terms of how we engage with families in the hood. For me, perhaps the most important part of Messy Church, although they're all important, is the meal time. It's sacramental, actually, in the widest possible sense. It's a place to meet with God as we meet with each other, and a place to friendships can grow. It's about discovering faith in the everyday. actually therefore very dismayed when I go to some messy churches, as I have done, where they miss out on the meal or they skimp on the meal. There is a debate in the amongst messy churches who work in areas of deprivation as to whether perhaps we are imposing some sort of middle-class values about eating together at a table, and I hear that, but actually there is something humanly important about eating and talking together that goes deeper than social class, surely. It came out in the UK during the Olympics, and during some of those special royal occasions we love, where we have street parties. People actually do love to gather around the long table and talk together. And Messy Church has given us an opportunity to do that in a way that's been very, very powerful. Though I did hear, sadly, a story recently in Messy Church where people who came were wanting to help at the meal, wanting to help clear away, but the Messy Church team said, "Oh no, we know what to do. You know, don't worry, you just sit there." And of course, that's a good example of not receiving, not letting them join in and be part of what's happening. Perhaps we close doors to mission by that so often. We don't let people help when they are offering help. It's being prepared to learn from other people that's so important as part of our sharing stories with those in the hood. So I've just put here some questions. I wonder whether the church has more to learn from families in the neighbourhood than it can begin to imagine. I wonder whether the church is prepared to do that learning, or whether it's caught up with its doing things for people. And I wonder what ways your church can learn from difference, or are you all comfortably the same? I'm watching my time, so I'll just move on, if it's all right, Stan, just to my last points here, because there's one big question that engages quite a lot of messy churches, and it's the challenge that is often expressed in church history about meeting needs or sharing the gospel, almost putting them opposite each other, juxtaposing them, when of course we should be doing both. Either, some people say, we should be doing the debt counselling or the food banks, or being advocates for families in struggling with the bureaucracy of benefit systems. That's what the church should be about. Others are saying, no, we must share Jesus first and foremost so that lives can be changed and so on. It's not just about good works. It's a story we come across. You know it from the book of James, faith and works. We need both of those things. And I often think, and I've come across this in some messy churches in more deprived areas, where they've brought a nice mix of that. The food bank, as I mentioned, has become linked to the messy church. I went to one messy church in the East End of London where they were looking at social justice as one of their Bible themes, and so made a very neat connection between what the Bible was saying, what Christians had to say about these things, and then they actually related it to some of the issues in their neighbourhood about the lack of safe place to play, and also all sorts of issues to do with the environment in their particular area. They brought the two together. Other people have said that messy church needs to be more messy, perhaps, in those areas, and I can understand that too, and I've come across that. And I think probably that comes from the fact that people have looked at messy church only in a certain social context. And if your concern in messy church is to get the craft right, or get the perfect meal, or to express the message very beautifully in your celebration time, that's actually missed what messy church is about. There's a quote here which I pinched from Lucy, I hope she doesn't mind. The biggest challenge in messy church isn't cooking sausages for 80, but the quality of faith, hope and love in our own lives that we're demonstrating to the families who come. Messy church is about reimagining church for families in the hood, making real honest connections with families, showing the best ways of learning, which are about apprenticeship models of learning from each other, seeing examples of what we do rather than having a course book or a lecture, or dare I say it, a sermon. It's about bringing the generations together rather than pulling them apart, and allowing faith to be passed on, as it was in the Jewish tradition, across age groups and social divides, by all being together rather than being siloed off. It's about becoming church. And of course it has the marks of church, I believe. Messy churches are now sharing a Eucharist meal together very often. There's messy masses happening. There's prayer at the centre of Messy Church. There are people praying together. Prayer spaces are happening. People are going on to explore the faith in little messy extras sometimes over coffee and cake together. And in one Messy Church I visited, they're now looking outwards and collecting money for charity. And that was in a very, very deprived area of Canterbury. So these are churches. They're not craft groups. They're not luncheon clubs. They're not just get-togethers of like-minded people, but they're centered around the story of God and Jesus. And that's the vital DNA of Messy Church. In lots of ways, no one expected Messy Church to spread like it has done, and so quickly. And I've enjoyed meeting so many Messy Church teams in rural places and in the suburbs and in inner cities, and they've made it work if they have listened to their area and taken the Messy Church values and inculturated them for the people around them. Many people are very suspicious of church as it is. Its systems, its authority values, its structures, sadly its history of abuse and so on. So the journey of friendship in Messy Church is a long one. But it's the sort of service I've seen offered in Messy Churches that's really quite excited me. And something that that is definitely connecting, I think, to families in the hood. I'll have a last set of questions, and then I'll leave some space at the end for Stan, and then a final summing up from me. Is it church? It's a long journey of friendship making, yes. Attitude to traditional church I've talked about. And finally, my questions are, what's your experience? What creative ways have you found to connect? Well, how messy are you prepared to let your church get to grow the kingdom of God on earth? Over to you, Stan.
Well, thank you, Martyn. Your presentation has been so wonderful. What I'm going to do is, before we get to a couple of these final questions and comments, I'm going to invite Enton in to share some closing information, and that way we can conclude then with the final comments and questions, and then give you, Martyn, some time to share your final thoughts as well. Enton?
Thank you, Stan, and Martyn, thank you so much. Stay with us. We have a few more questions to go. But for those of you who are participating with us, I'd invite you to take a moment to respond to the polls that I put up. There's just two quick questions. The first is, how helpful was the presentation or Martyn's content and learning? And the second, how well did you like this webinar format or these online meetings? For those of you with the Church of the Brethren that are seeking continuing education units, I'm posting now the ability to be able to get those. And so for those participating in the live webcasts, and unfortunately not the recordings, but those of you here live today, you're able to get continuing education units for your participation, and I've posted that link in the chat window as well. But without further ado, let me turn it back, Martyn, to you and Stan, and let you continue. Stan, be sure to speak up. Martyn's mic is still quite a bit hotter than yours, so project a little bit and we'll keep the two of you going.
All right, will do. There's a lot of conversation about the rapid growth of Messy Church in the UK compared to the United States and also Canada, and that Canada seems to have caught on to it more so than what the United States has. Jackie shares, Martyn, I think you are saying that true hospitality is both giving and receiving. I think I need to explore that a bit more. Have you any pointers for of others who have written and reflected on this as well?
There are some bits of writing on hospitality. We're actually engaged in looking at that ourselves. Lucy, who's listening to this, is engaged at the moment, or very soon, in writing something about messy hospitality. And I know there's some other good books that have come out, but I can't think of them off the top of my head, sorry. But maybe, I do know Julie Swan, and I'll be meeting her soon, so maybe I can share some of those when I come down to Cornwall, where she is.
And I know Christine Pohl's book on hospitality is very good. There's also Martyn, your presentation reminded me of a book. I can't think of his first name. Last name is Bauman, Bauman, on the mission table, and reflects and he is Lutheran, and has served as bishop, and he talks about numerous ministries that he's observed in the United States that carry much like that messy church characteristics. And his is around you shape values and faith around what he calls the mission table. And that table is so important to the life of the church. Julie shares, we have several people who want to help with serving the meal at one of our messy churches, which is great and supports what you're saying, but it really stops them engaging with conversation over the meal and makes the meal just something for children rather than for adults as well. It's a real conundrum, and we're not sure how to tackle this. What suggestions might you have for Julie?
Yeah, I've seen that happen. It's become a children's party rather than an all-age meal. The best examples have been where very deliberately the team have all sat and scattered and sat down with the with those who are coming to Messy Church. Perhaps having the food on the tables first is a good idea, so people can serve, rather like in a school meals way, perhaps. You have to make some practical adjustments, I think, to give space for that conversation to happen and those friendships to be made. It needs some intentional, thoughtful, logistical changes, basically, and they are possible. They are possible.
And go ahead.
Yes, because I'm watching the time.
Well, I was just going to say, I'll respond to one other. And Susan earlier made a comment that she's been discerning, a venture in ministry, and is curious about this. And so what if there is a person or a group that is looking at starting a missional church, and thinking along the lines of the Messy Church movement? What are some of the first steps in getting a Messy Church going, or that seed planted?
Very quickly, there are now a lot of Messy Churches, and if you go to the website, which is messychurch.org.uk, you can find a directory, and so you can see where some Messy Churches are. And I would advise to go and look and see what's happening. They won't all be perfect, but it'll give you a flavour of what people are riskily trying to do to step into the neighbourhood, to be alongside people as Jesus was. There are some books. BRF have produced a range of books that give us insights, how to start your Messy Church 1, 2 and 3. Get in touch with us on the website, and we can direct you to some local regional coordinators who have some ideas. We're able to come alongside you. We are very friendly and open, and we'd love to talk to you. So contact us at messychurch.org.uk, and we can point you in the right direction.
Okay. Well, we want to be sensitive to time. I just want to check and make sure. And then Kathy writes, I think if your whole team is intentional about chatting to people, then those conversations will happen. I think she was responding as well to the question that I had. Martyn, if you have just a minute or two, let's give people a chance to share any final comments or thoughts. I know sometimes a chat box takes a little longer to share those comments than what it does is if we're just sitting face to face. But this has really been an engaging presentation, and I think it's really for us to remember that this is truly a fresh expression of church, not just another program to try to expand a current congregation. And we want to thank everybody for being with us today and sharing your comments and thoughts. And Martyn, to close out, I'd just like to ask you, are there any final comments that you would like to make?
I started with Winston Churchill, do you remember? And his leadership in crisis, it was unequalled, it was very special. The local church is the vehicle for sharing the kingdom of God, as Jesus has revealed it to us. Now, Christians, like Sir Winston, have something important to offer to a world in crisis. Leadership, in times of peril. But the way in which the church is called to do it is a rather dangerous and risky one. Unlike Sir Winston, we are to follow the example of Jesus and step into the neighbourhood to win the hearts and minds of people by sharing completely their lives. Now, there are many ways of doing this, I'm sure, but for me, Messy Church has provided a particularly unique way for the church to attempt this incarnation. We don't want to remain distant with our story or aloof like the great Sir Winston, but be like Jesus, the man of sorrows acquainted with grief. If we're to love people into the kingdom of God, I think that's the way forward to connect with families in our particular hood. Thank you very much for listening. I hope there's something there, food for thought, and you will be blessed by some of those ideas.
Well, thank you, Martyn, very much for your presentation today. Very engaging, very energizing, and also the content that you presented today really gives us something to take away and to think about and to apply in our own community and setting. Again, thank you for your tech support and all that you've provided as well. And to our collaborators in this effort, Bristol Baptist College, the Center for Family Ministries at Bristol Baptist College, that's the Center for Family and Childhood Studies at Bristol Baptist College, Urban Expression U.K, and Baptist Together, and the Church of the Brethren. Thank you all for supporting these webinars, and thank you for all of you that are here today connecting from wherever you may be. Your support is very important to us and deeply appreciated. And we wish you Godspeed and a great day. Thank you.